Thank you so very much, and welcome once again. I'd also like to welcome our guest preacher, who is John Miller, and he's a member of this congregation. He and Marilyn have been in this congregation for about 3 years, and before they came here, this is their 5th UU congregation. Get my notes there. So they have been at Fairfax, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Oakland before here. And in fact, Marilyn and John met and married at the Oakland UU. So we're so happy to have someone from the congregation who says, I have this theme, I've been thinking about this, and be brave enough to say, I would like to share this. And so that's what we have today at our service. John also said he's one of those rare UU Republicans. And I think that's great. And I think everyone understands how we're all diverse. And we're trying to understand what it really means to live honestly and with justice in a diverse world. And you're going to hear a little bit more of that. And you're going to hear about struggle in this particular service. And to end, I'd like to end with these opening words. These are words. They sit still. Feel their struggle to be born and grow, change, die, and seed. Grace is life and death. Death can help you. Gratitude is everywhere. Angels can come. Spirit never finishes.
Our reading this morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 through 28. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and have prevailed." At 100 Maryland Avenue Northeast in Washington, D.C., stands a temple to the mid-20th century apotheosis of mainline Protestantism, the United Methodist Building. Sitting across the street from the Supreme Court, it has the distinction of being the only non-governmental building on Capitol Hill. Its dedication in January 1924 attracted William Jennings Bryant and Gifford Pinchot. Methodists had been the key drivers of Prohibition, and contemporary newspapers noted the loyalty of Methodists to, quote, civic righteousness as the true foundation of sane progress, unquote. The building was intended as a sentinel to social reform at the heart of our nation's government. Even with the repeal of prohibition, Methodists in the post-war period continued to bear witness to their faith with the confidence that they were the conscience of continuing progress towards a more perfect union. 4 years after the dedication, my mother was born 300 miles away in a small southern town that embraced that religious moment. It was no accident that the Methodists, who were traditionally drawn from the middle class in those towns, were the vanguards of what came to be derided as middle-class morality. In the 1930s and 40s, nobody had the luxury of idle time. You just put your head down and went about your life as you knew it, grateful that your character and your religion allowed you to put food on the table, and that the freedoms of America spared you the horrors of the world. The ultimate victory in World War II and the economic boom that followed validated for many the superiority of the capitalist, religious, political, cultural alliance that continued its dominance through the 1950s. Many, like my mother, saw themselves as the vanguard of a prosperous moral future. Onward, Christian soldiers. There was no doubt about the meaning of their lives or how God was working through them. While the Vietnam War was the public face of the splintering of this alliance, a more profound change ate away at it from below. The approval and marketing in 1961 of Enovid, the first combined hormonal contraceptive. For those seeking the advanced education necessary to be at the forefront of the technological revolution, the pill was a godsend. No longer need sex be tied to the fear of inadvertent fertility. Victorian England had pioneered many different class attitudes towards sex outside of marriage. Upper-class men were free to pursue their sexual appetites as they had the financial resources to support the cottage industry that catered to raising illegitimate children. Upper-class women were free as well, once they had produced a legitimate heir. Many of the younger and illegitimate sons of these shifting arrangements became the driving forces expanding the British Empire in the 19th century. At the other end of the spectrum, the children of lower-class women became economic assets by age 6, so there was less social pressure to only have children within marriage. But the middle class was different. Deferring childbearing and in deference to the contraceptive technology of the time, sex, until marriage had a sound economic footing. The stability of religiously sanctioned families underpinned advancement through the middle class. While the Methodists had originated early in the establishment of these cultural trends, they were indeed the heir and champion to them. And the pill snapped the strongest link in the chain. My mother never came to terms with the shifting cultural mores. The Christmas after my father's death, Marilyn and I visited her as an engaged couple in our 30s. We stayed at a nearby hotel rather than in each of her 2 guest rooms. Her church was no more rapid in its acceptance. The 2016 version of the Methodist Book of Discipline states, quote, "Although all persons are sexual beings, whether or not they are married, sexual relations are affirmed only with the covenant of monogamous, heterosexual marriage." I find this a masterful sentence in what it says and what it does not. It does not condemn sex outside of marriage. It does not condemn homosexuality. Yet, for a church that reached its mid-century pinnacle on the back of personal probity and the social gospel, it is just about as far as it can go. That one sentence in the Book of Discipline both points to social pathologies in the wake of the pill that we have not yet come to terms with, as well as the increasing irrelevance of mainline Protestantism in addressing them. For indeed, there are pathologies that have grown in recent years. I am one of 25 grandchildren of a Pennsylvania coal miner, and the spectrum of our lives covers a vast experience. One cousin lives in comfort in New Canaan, Connecticut, the wife of a retired pharmaceutical CEO. Another, with whom the family has lost touch, had her 3rd child by 3 different fathers by her early 20s. She bought fully into the freedom that came with the destigmatization of sex outside of marriage, but had neither the inner resources nor a remaining religious connection to avoid completely losing her moorings. Her experience was also quite different than it would have been 20 years prior because of the growth of the social safety net. The expansion of welfare in the 60s made possible her choice to raise those children as a single mother. While none of us would want to return to a time where such children might go hungry through lack of public support, we must also recognize that we have enabled a vast new experiment in family formation and the environments in which children mature. Some such effects are undeniably good, such as giving women the economic ability to leave abusive relationships. Others are novel and troubling, a direct consequence of a secular focus solely on physical and economic needs. And there's a big flashing red light staring right in our faces, telling us how badly we are failing on this score. In 2016, there were over 54,000 deaths nationwide from opioid overdoses. By comparison, 58,000 American soldiers died in the entire Vietnam War. In the February 19, 2018 issue of New York Magazine, Andrew Sullivan wrote a major and important article on the crisis, which I commend to you. He cites many interconnected causes, but beyond the vastly increased potency of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, he focuses on the atomization of our society today. Where we used to go to the church social, we now scroll Facebook for likes and photo tags. Where we used to get on the phone and hear another human voice, we now text in short bursts, notable for their efficiency of communication. The receptors in our brain for opioids are precisely the ones triggered by human interaction. We are social creatures and need that interaction. For those not getting it, opioids are an easy substitute. This is a challenge to our society and our faith at all levels. There's certainly an acute response necessary, and I have confidence we know well how to address that. We must be a source of education for those who walk through our doors, a fount of unjudging support for those afflicted by opioid addiction and their families, and a network that connects those in need with resources beyond what we can provide. But that's the easy part. It plays to our strengths. It is also just a temporary local patch on a much broader problem. For us to answer a call to respond to the chronic problem will require us wrestling with God as Jacob did. Where is that deeper spiritual calling? The work my grandfather did in the mines was hard, nasty work, but it was available to anyone willing to show up at the top of the elevator shaft. People still needed coal during the Depression to heat their homes and power the new electric plants being built in pursuit of Roosevelt's dream of rural electrification. I only wondered later in life how my dad and his 7 siblings lived together in what seemed like a large house to a small child, but woefully inadequate in the eyes of an adult. While there was always food on the table, they were never far away from true poverty. Yet there was meaning to my grandfather's life. It came mostly externally, from his vocation, from raising his family, and from the local Catholic Church. 70 years later, this same small town could be the poster child for the opioid epidemic. What happened? In just the span of my lifetime, many forms of manual labor have disappeared or become devalued. In that respect, pardon the pun, the town my father grew up in is a canary in the coal mine for what will increasingly affect all forms of labor. Already, information technology substitutes for many white-collar vocations. Even physicians are not immune. IBM wants its cognitive engine, Watson, to be a diagnostic assistant by every doctor's side within a decade. We are drifting unconsidered into a future where our successes undermine our need to work and the accompanying meaning that work creates in our lives. What will replace it? We can already see that a screen is a poor substitute. While seeming to increase social connectivity, it accomplishes the opposite. The anonymity of the web cultures all sorts of social pathologies. Some behaviors, like school shootings, emerge irregularly to shock us. Others eat away quietly at the fabric of our society as we lose many down the road of opioid addiction. The utopian imagings of the 1950s of an abundant, leisurely life being served by robots, Jetson style, is revealed to be a dystopia where humans cannot create meaning. It is this spiritual struggle with which we must wrestle. My mom wrestled with material and financial challenges in her life, but never with God. She was born into the Methodist moment, embraced it, and carried that meaning to her grave. We Unitarians had our moment too, in our unflinching support for the civil rights movement. It was righteous work, and we justly celebrate Unitarian martyrs like James Reeb, an associate minister of All Souls Church, who died in support of the Selma marches in 1965. We wrestled with racism in the 1960s and won important victories. It gives meaning to our religious identity. But the pride we take in that moment carries the danger that we will view contemporary spiritual needs too heavily through a racial lens. No doubt racial justice work is incomplete, but it's natural and easy for us to imagine it a sufficient challenge for today. We must consciously decide to broaden our wrestling to the larger spiritual crisis confronting us. Jacob's story is a peculiar one to modern ears. He emerges from the womb, grasping at his twin's heel, as if to announce his persistence to the struggle he will have through life. He buys Esau's birthright, then tricks his father Isaac into blessing him rather than his older brother. That blessing does him little good as he flees from his brother's anger into the arms of his cunning uncle, who extracts 7 extra years of labor from him to marry his love Rachel. He then in turn tricks his uncle and flees before him towards Esau, fearing the wrath of the twin he had betrayed 2 decades prior. At the ford in the river, he camps alone, with his uncle behind him and Esau in front. It is here he wrestles God, or an angel, or a spirit of the river. Different traditions intersect with the dimly viewed religious beliefs of pre-Israelite Canaan. What is the blessing that he secures? It is a reconfirmation of the one Yahweh had made with his grandfather Abraham, choosing his descendants to be in a special covenant. But just like Jacob, that blessing doesn't seem to help the Israelites all that much. They're constantly falling out with Yahweh, being invaded here, enslaved there, and exiled to Babylon. So what ultimately is that blessing? It is simply the opportunity to struggle. And by Jacob never giving up that struggle, he secures the blessing of mattering. His life has meaning. Every impulse of our society, political or technological, aims towards reducing the need to struggle. How will humanity matter in a society that needs less labor and loses the concept of vocation? How will Unitarians matter in addressing that spiritual need? No one can point unerringly to the path we must follow. Indeed, we would be wise to pursue a wide spectrum of ideas and reinforce those that work best. I have 3 to suggest as a beginning. The post-war period has witnessed vast changes in the institution of the family. In addition to the pill liberating sexuality from family formation, increased workforce participation by women and the social safety net have replaced some of the economic function of families. The result has been increased divorce rates, out-of-wedlock births, and individuals who never marry. The cultural bias towards marriage and families in the 1950s could be oppressive to those stuck in bad marriages, and it's good that the social pressure to remain in such a marriage has abated. Yet there remains strong evidence that children raised in 2-parent families have better lifetime economic prospects, as well as lower rates of crime and addiction. As we traverse the spectrum of economic inequality, one of the less noted privileges of affluence is the greater likelihood a child is raised in a stable 2-parent home. Moreover, families are a focus of social support and creating meaning. Whether any of us matter more broadly in society, everyone who is held closely in a family matters to those nearest them. Families are the best bulwark against atomizing social trends. To believe in families, though, is not to insist on returning to Ozzie and Harriet. There's been a great struggle over the past decade defining what constitutes a family, and Unitarians have been a core contributor to enlarging the idea to include those traditionally excluded. Far from gays and lesbians being a threat to the family, they can reinvigorate the institution by creating families that reflect their special insights and contributions. UUs must seize the opportunity to build on the credibility we generated in our support for gay marriage to continue to enlarge the idea of the family. The reciprocal affection and respect among family members need not be limited to traditional ones. Already we have among us experiments large and small, such as co-housing and covenant groups. Our interactions with the community around us should be framed in the question of what kind of family are we creating here, and what does it need to thrive? Here we are well positioned to provide principled, compassionate leadership. I will shamelessly steal my second suggestion from the Methodists, to evangelize for discipline. No doubt many of you think of yourselves as disciplined or practice a discipline. It is a value I struggle to inculcate in my children, and if I'm being honest, in myself. It became endemic in my father's generation as they survived the Depression and fought World War II. He would pinpoint the year it went out of vogue as 1972. On his Navy discharge papers in 1946, the section desired employment was filled in as football coach. While not the stereotypical Woody Hayes martinet, my father's success as a high school coach came from discipline, both his and that he instilled in his players. During football season, I rarely saw him on a weekend as he spent hours in the film room, cutting and splicing with the scissors and liquid cement that was state of the art before computers became ubiquitous. One manifestation of what he expected of his players was that they cut their hair short for the season. He considered that a small concession to the privilege of playing football and a necessary safety precaution for properly fitting helmets. His 1972 team was expected to be among the best in the DC metropolitan area. However, 7 of his core players chose maintaining their long hair over playing football, and he struggled to a 2-7-1 record. He resigned after that season, heartbroken that the culture of youth had changed so dramatically from that when he was growing up. Modern society requires far less discipline to accomplish many tasks. When I attended college, a student had to spend many hours in the library reading books to acquire the knowledge to navigate adult life. Today, we all carry many such libraries in our pocket. Hello, Google. Indeed, I reference the internet to be precise in some facts embedded in this sermon. Yet that ubiquity dulls us to the fact that information is not the same as understanding. Understanding requires the discipline of reading, of pondering, of discussing. Discipline is hard to sell by itself, so we must find ways to share passions that require it and centrally include instruction and discipline to those pursuits. This is especially important in how we educate our youth, as they will be the ones most affected by the technological advances over their lives. We may not need discipline as much for our ancestors as our ancestors for our physical well-being, but we will need it more for our spiritual well-being. My final suggestion is one that I sense will be the most challenging for us: to deeply re-engage the concept of sin. We have no equivalent of the Book of Discipline, but a web search on the words Unitarian and sin turns up a discussion on the website of the British equivalent of the UUA. It leads off by saying, quote, "Sin is a word with baggage attached. That is why Unitarians often avoid it or use it only sparingly." There are many historical struggles that have led UUs to that discomfort, from Unitarian arguments against original sin to Universalist preaching that sinners were not barred from salvation. To the extent that we ascribe sin today, it is usually to institutions that perpetuate what we judge to be injustice, or to individuals who do not examine or admit to their subconscious biases. But that's too narrow a view for this emerging spiritual crisis. Knowing Unitarians, we could debate endlessly what it means to sin and never reach a consensus. However, I would propose a simple idea. A sin is any action that undermines our ability to evoke our best selves. By reference, it would encompass the golden rule or the categorical imperative, as treating others as means undermines our own best selves. By this standard, becoming addicted to opioids is a sin. However, that highlights a danger we must avoid, that of equating being a sinner with being fallen or being out of grace. Here we must don our universalist heritage and proclaim that while indeed we are all sinners, we say that out of a deep love for humanity and our willingness to support one another in overcoming sin. In our own litany of atonement, often read near Yom Kippur, we say, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. The confession of sin is cleansing, and we can embrace our inner sinner with a modern form of redemption. If this sounds like a Judeo-Christian sermon, it is. There's a middle ground between the full embrace of Christian epistemology and the dryness of the Jefferson Bible. The Methodist building on Capitol Hill still houses a small Methodist office, along with those of a variety of allied groups. It was perhaps too much to think that it could fulfill the vision of its builders as the moral sentinel of our experiment in self-governance. Its failure to do so is a cautionary tale. Will we erect virtual temples to our moral conceits of the moment? Or will we dig deeply to find the spirituality and the compassion in a struggle worthy of Jacob? If we engage that struggle and witness to the world as we do, we too will matter, and we will find Jacob's blessing.